Hey all. A lot of people ask for advice on their rotation, when to use certain cards, generally feeling like their DPS is lower than where it should be at. So I figured I'd throw together a guide that compiles many tips and tricks and things that I've learned over my time playing Arcana, and 440 in particular. Now, note that this is an advanced guide that assumes that you're already familiar with how Arcana works. I won't go over what skills do, what cards do, etc. For that, if you're a brand new Arcana player, go to this link, read up on the community guide. It's written by very knowledgeable people, and you'll learn why we use the skills we do, what cards do, what trappers to get, etc., all that good stuff. So go to this link. So this guide is mostly targeted for intermediate players who have a decent understanding of Empress, but are struggling to take their DPS to the next level. So if you play Arcana, but you're struggling to get Cruel Fighter every fight, the video is for you. If you're an expert player, you probably won't learn that much, but maybe you'll learn a thing or two. Note also, I have been playing 440 ever since the build has been available to the West, so everything I'm going to talk about in this video is in the lens of 440, although a lot of these tips can and will apply to any Empress build that uses the skills that we'll be talking about in the video. Before I get into the guide itself, I want to touch very briefly on engravings. I'm not going to go over every engraving, but I want to talk about Barricade versus Raid Captain. A lot of people will say they're interchangeable, and for the most part that's correct. But if you're gonna play 440, I strongly recommend that you play Raid Captain over Barricade. So why? This build is a snowball build. So with the Wealth Runes, you get more cards, and with more cards it means you get more Judgments and more Boundless, because a lot of cards will accelerate your rotation, which means you get even more cards. And that kind of cycles, and you kind of get the idea. So basically, you really want Wealth Runes. The build uses Wealth Runes extremely well due to having 4 reds. It's also your only way to generate meter. You don't have evoke like 242. And it utilizes cards amazingly well. I'll talk more about that later in the card section. It's also really easy to maintain Raid Captain efficiency. You have 3 blue skills with movement speed tripods. And by default, Raid Captain has a higher ceiling than Barricade, and you're playing this build for higher ceiling anyways. If you want consistency, you should be playing 332 Barricade. Okay, so now for the actual meat of the guide. So people always ask, what's wrong with my rotation? Can you help me with my rotation? So first things first, there is no rotation in Arcana. Right? So that's the main thing you have to understand, is that there is no rotation in Arcana, and instead you should be thinking of things as priorities that shift based on cards and boss patterns, etc. The number one most important thing to keep in mind that you should do is that you need to play fast. Okay, so you want to be upkeeping Boundless as much as possible, get as many casts as possible of your strong ruins, and you get as many cards as possible. So I'm going to go through a breakdown of tips for each skill so that you can understand how to achieve that. The goal is that eventually you're able to do all these things that I'm going to be talking about instinctively without having to think about it, so that you can just play fast while you're also playing efficiently. So your core goal, and this is gonna sound super obvious, is to get as many ruins out as possible with 4 stacks, Call of Destiny buff, and full Raid Captain efficiency. It's important to keep that in mind, even though it's obvious, because when you look at anything that you do, any decision that you have to make, it always comes back to this. So, here are the things that you're gonna need to think about in order to achieve that one goal. This is kind of a general list of things, and again, a lot of these points will sound obvious, but we'll get to why you have to keep all of them in mind. Not getting knocked down or dying. Obvious, again, you don't want to get hit. But the reason this is mentioned is because while bosses are doing attacks and patterns, you're having to dodge them, which will mess up your perfect rotation, right? So you have to be able to adapt on the fly, and there are many things you can do, particularly with your blue skill usage, to continue stacking, increase your uptime while dodging enemy attacks. Now this one might be obvious for some, But this is something that a lot of people get wrong, and it is planning the proper red priority. Okay, so Cull, Judgement, Seren, then Rain, then Cull, Seren, then Garden, then Four of a Kind, and then way behind regular Seren. So you'll see I haven't mentioned Cull for Rain or Garden or Four of a Kind. That's because that doesn't really change the priority. And generally, you know, if you're using Cull, Seren, you're using Cull on Rain. But this is, you know, the big one is some people might use Seren without cards when it's off CD just because they have 4 stacks and it's off CD, but they're not thinking about the fact that Rain is coming off CD in 3 seconds. So I'll go into more details later in the video, but that's the idea. Is you don't want to be wasting stacks on lower priority red skills when a better red skill might be available now or soon. Now another one that may not be as obvious is also planning proper blue skill priority. So Scratch is number 1, then Edge, then Flip. So this isn't as important as your red skill priority, but the idea is that you want to have as much safety device uptime as possible for the attack speed buff, because the attack speed buff actually allows you to get more skills out faster. Using Cull of Destiny as often as possible, keeping the red priority in mind. So anytime that Cull of Destiny is off CD is time wasted, but you also don't want to mindlessly throw it out if it means that you're losing the COD buff on, for example, Rain. You want to bleed as little card meter as possible while using cards as efficiently as possible. So, as mentioned before, 440 uses cards very, very well. They're a massive part of your DPS. And so whenever you're on 2 cards and you're using ruins and you're wasting meter, that will hurt your overall DPS. And finally, obvious, use skills as fast as possible and being boundless as much as possible. I mention this because basically the higher uptime, the higher your APM, the faster you play, all of the above is just going to be enhanced, right? And like I mentioned earlier, this is a snowball build. So the faster you play, the more skills out you get, the more cards you get, the more skills you can get out, etc, etc, etc. You're doing more damage. It just snowballs, right? So the faster you play, the higher damage. Okay, so now that we have the general idea of how you should be playing the game, I'm going to go through every skill with notes, tips, and tricks, and prio. And ideally, by the end of this, you should have all the tools you need to make the proper decision of which skill to use at any point. Which is a decision that changes based on cooldowns, cards, buff patterns, mechanics, etc. Okay, so first off, Scratch Dealer. This is your number 1 prio blue skill. You should always prioritize to use Scratch Dealer for stacking blues, if it's available, because of safety device, which is an attack speed and movement speed buff, and it's also your only synergy in 440, so this is a super, super, super important skill. A very important technique with Scratch Dealer to improve your uptime is to know that the combo can be delayed for in-out patterns. Both the second and the third combo can be delayed for quite a bit actually, which, as you'll see in this variety of clips I'm going to be showing, is useful in pretty much every single raid. The reason this technique is so important is because, as I mentioned before, you want as much uptime as possible on safety device, because 1, you need it for raid captain efficiency. So raid captain, you will only max out raid captain without a blue skill if you're in boundless with the ghost card. So otherwise, you need a move speed buff like safety device. As for the attack speed buff, you're only capped if you have the mayhem card. So if you don't have mayhem, you do not want to forego the combo if possible. Now, because you want to use it as much as possible, you also gotta be careful and aim where you're gonna come back with safety device. Now, like I said earlier, you need to adapt your rotation depending on what's happening. In these examples, sometimes you need to give up on safety device in order to fit one extra ruin, for example, if a mech is about to happen. Another thing to be careful about is when you're using Scratch Dealer, you want to be careful where your character ends up, because the hitbox might make you overlap patterns, such as the Arcana Pie. And as a very last resort, you can use Scratch to save yourself from death as a non-stacking skill, just a movement skill. Alright, Spiral Edge. This is your second most important blue skill. It is your fastest stacking blue skill when you do not have balance, but it is also your shortest move speed buff. So you generally do not want to use it as the movement speed buff before Judgement because it will run out. You really want to get in the habit of thinking of this skill as two different skills instead of one combo, because you most of the time will not use it twice in a row. The biggest advantage of Spiral Edge over the other two blue skills is that it is much more flexible in terms of being able to move while stacking. It is amazing to be able to dodge all the patterns while still stacking up and keeping your uptime up. So it has a pretty large area of effect, much larger than it looks. So you should really get intimately familiar with how large it actually is, so that you'll be able to use it to stack very safely during tons of different patterns. The most notable one is K-Angle Gate 3. Every single line you can just stack around. Now sometimes you actually do want to aim edge into the boss directly, so that you don't miss, and it will prevent you from going into attacks that you didn't mean to go into. Like I mentioned earlier, it's very important that you think about edge as two different stacking skills instead of just one. Because most of the time, you will not do both activations in a row. You will either weave in a red skill or Cull of Destiny. Sometimes you'll even weave in auto attacks from Three-Headed Snake. So this is a critical part to gaining more uptime. Finally, sometimes you want to delay the second activation just so you have the movement speed buff for the next ruin after Cull of Destiny. Alright, next up, Dealer's Flip. This is your third and lowest priority blue skill due to its long cooldown. It has the longest move speed buff out of all your blue skills, so you can kind of throw it early before Cull of Destiny and still have the movement speed buff for red skills. You can also throw it before Judgement to have the movement speed buff for the entirety of Judgement, although most of the time you want to use Scratch Dealer anyways. Unlike Safety Device, the Dealer's Flip combo doesn't do anything, so sometimes you can just not do it to gain some uptime. Where Flip really shines is in its ability to reposition yourself while still being able to stack on the boss. Also be careful of where you're launching yourself to. Sometimes you need to delay just a little bit. Sometimes you also need to adjust your rotation on the fly. In this example, I would have normally used edge twice, but I used flip to get out of the red circle while still doing all my combo. Finally, make sure to use flip when not overlapping the boss or you might miss. Okay, so now for the only yellow skill in the build, which is considered a blue skill, which is why this is called 440. This is the most important skill in the build, Cull of Destiny. Everything revolves around Cull of Destiny. So this is your only crit damage buff. You do not use return, so you must hit this. This is very important that you hit this every single time. A level 9 COD CDR gem is recommended, so you can have very close to 100% uptime in Boundless. And pretty much you always want to use COD as your last stack, so i.e. use it when the boss has 2 stacks, so that you use COD, instantly use a red, and so with max attack speed sometimes you're actually able to fit 3 reds in one Call of Destiny, but most of the time you want to be able to at least fit 2 ruins in it, usually Garden and Rain. Okay, so this one is very important, especially the lower your cooldown gems are. So pay very close attention to your red skills cooldown, especially in Addiction, and make sure that when you use COD, you're able to fit 2 red skills in it. Unless you have, only one of CD, and then you'll be back up for the next run. So the most important thing is that you really want Rain to pretty much always have the Call of Destiny buff. Or with other runes, it's not as important, but Rain should really always have it. So what does that mean? When you look at your cooldowns, and if Rain or Garden is at 3 seconds or less left on cooldown, with blue skills, then you can use it. Otherwise, you may want to wait. And I'll also reiterate, right, remember the red skill priority that I mentioned at the start of this video. Sometimes you'll see in these clips that I'm waiting and I'm not using Seren or 4 of a kind with the COD buff because Rain or Garden is coming off cooldowns and they are better ruins. Now this one is a pretty simple one, pretty obvious one, but whenever there's a boss that has patterns or mechanics that you know exactly where they're gonna land, where they're gonna appear, you can pre-cast COD because it has some travel time, so that you get more uptime. On the same idea of travel time, if you cast COD further away from you, that means you have more time with the buff because you're finishing your animation as COD is traveling through the air. So most of the time this doesn't matter, but it is actually quite useful sometimes. The extra tenths of seconds is useful for tight timings. This is easier on larger bosses like Frog. Something to keep in mind, even though COD is not a movement skill, it does have a slight backstep movement, which can be both helpful to dodge mechanics or sometimes dangerous, like in Arcana Gate 1 for very tight circles. Finally, some finicky things to be aware of. There are some objects, like the Sunnyvale Orb, that can block Call of Destiny. Or if you put your cursor up the map, it will not cast as far as possible, it will cast at your feet. Alright, ruins. So, Celestial Rain, this is your strongest ruin. This is the highest priority skill at all times. You should always have the Call of Destiny buff for Rain. If you don't, it means you didn't apply your rotation accordingly or you missed the skill somehow. Just like Call of Destiny, it can be precast for more uptime. Something to be very careful about, it doesn't have paralysis immunity, so be careful not to get it cancelled. I don't have a ton of clips that are specifically for Rain, because you'll see Rain in every single other clip. Generally, the main important thing is this is your most important ruin, just make sure you buff it all the time. The one important note about Rain is that you should use your buff cards, like Cull, TF, Judgement, Joy, even Star, right after casting Rain, but before it hits the enemies. Also, this does not apply for Moon, you should cast it beforehand. Okay, on to Secret Garden. This is your second strongest ruin. It has the shortest cooldown. This is fine to use without Call of Destiny because the CD is so short, but you should still aim to use it with Call of Destiny as much as possible, especially in Addiction. It also does not have paralysis immunity, although it can be immune with spacebar because it's so quick for ticking AoEs that paralyze you, like Sonovel AoE. So this is partly due to the fact that I believe that safety device is so important on Scratch Dealer, but you should use spacebar extremely offensively when combined with Sacred Garden, following either Scratch Dealer or sometimes Flip when you couldn't use the combo to get back in there and make sure that you fit Sacred Garden into the Call of Destiny buff. I use the spacebar offensively incredibly often, and you have to be smart about thinking whether you're gonna need spacebar soon or not. For example, KG3 during the Sunlight mech, but definitely use a spacebar aggressively often. And quick note, since it's a small AoE around you, Secret Garden is a great way to keep DPSing during Medusa patterns. Okay, moving on to 4 of a kind. This is your third highest prio red skill, but it is a highly variable prio, so I'll touch on that in a little bit. This is the biggest winner with the Judgement card, aside from Cull Seren. So you really want to use Judgement when 4 of a kind is up and pray for those resets. Just like Rain and Garden, it doesn't have paralysis immunity, so be careful when you use it. When Cull of Destiny is down, I tend to give 4 of a kind a higher prio than the unbuffed Secret Garden due to the meter gain. 4 of a kind is also a destruction skill, so sometimes when you need to do a destruction check while you can still DPS, using 4 of a kind is the highest prio skill. And sometimes, due to how the boss moves, 4 of a kind becomes higher prio over Secret Garden, because the only way you would fit 2 reds in a Cull of Destiny buff would be to use 4 of a kind over Secret Garden thanks to its range. So for this one you really just have to think on your feet and think fast. 3 stack 4 of a kind. This is a controversial opinion, but basically you should use it when you're able to use your next useful red without delay. So either when you're fresh in your rotation, everything's off cooldown, or when you know things are gonna land correctly, like in this clip, because I'm gonna use Scratch and then COD for my Rain. Finally, 4 of a kind has really high base damage, so you can kind of spam it if you're not going to be able to fit an actual ruin, or if you need the raw damage for mechanics. Alright, last but not least, Serendipity. So this is the card that makes the build. This is why 332 is more consistent, and this is why 440 has the highest highs. So without cards, this skill is terrible, it's a DPS loss, more on that later. So this is only stronger than Rain, where it is used with both Cull plus Judgement. Even with just Cull, it is worse than Rain, but you should still 100% make sure to fit it in the Cull window. This is also your only red skill with paralysis immunity, so you can sometimes abuse that. The second hit of Seren has more range than the first, so you can proc stacks from a little further away. And both hits counter. So like I've mentioned, Seren is the worst red if you do not have cards, so you really do not want to be using it over any other reds. However, like 3 stack 4 of a kind, it is fine to use if you can guarantee you have stacks for your next good red. You can spacebar the second hit of Seren if you're not using it with Judgement, because you only care about the first ruin proc. This allows for a little more uptime, as you can dodge things and get to using other useful skills faster. Last but not least, last skill I want to talk about is the Awakening, in particular the Awakening combo. I see a lot of people do actually the wrong combo, so I'm going to go over and explain what the right combo is and what all the situations you want to use it in are. The standard opener should be Scratch Awakening, space, COD, Rain, edge twice, Garden flip into 3 stack 4 of a kind. What this does is it guarantees your Garden gets Cull of Destiny buff and that you enter boundless on the second rotation. Now one thing to note is that this rotation is very tight on the timing for the Awakening animation cancel, so you require Yearning for the attack speed, so make sure that your support has hit the boss and you have Yearning buff. Now while you want to do the Awakening opener most of the time, there are some gates where you can't guarantee the boss is not going to move, like a KG3, so sometimes you just want to do a regular rotation if you already have Nightmare. And in a similar style, sometimes the boss could completely fly away, completely ruin even your first rotation, so you really just want to wait for the first pattern to happen and then send the rotation based on what the boss is doing once you know you're going to be able to land everything. In other gates, the start combo might be completely scripted. So for example, a Kanji 1, he will always jump at the start, which means you can always do the same rotation every single time. And finally, one note that is not about the opener combo is your Awakening forces addiction regardless of whether you're in addiction or boundless, which means that you can force addiction before a huge burst like a Cold Judgment to guarantee that you're getting all the addiction damage, and then you're going quickly back into boundless because you're still at low mana. Alright, so now let's talk about cards. So first I'm gonna quickly touch on the cards that I don't really have many clips for, because these are the cards that you pretty much use immediately upon getting them, and you generally don't want to use Clown on them. But clowning them is not bad though. In some cases, for example, for Moon or Corrosion, these are okay cards for Clown in certain scenarios when you're waiting for boss mech or something. Alright, first let's talk about the 4 buff cards that do not affect your rotation. Corrosion is a great card, free 10% damage. Just use it when you have it. Moon is also an amazing card. 20% CDR. Significantly increases your DPS, especially when it's combined with Mayhem. Moon plus Mayhem is basically boundless, it's amazing, and this is a great snowball card. Mayhem is a very solid card as well. You will hit the attack speed cap even in Addiction. Attack speed becomes a bottleneck in Boundless plus Moon, so Mayhem helps you get more reds, which translates to more DPS and more cards. So once again, this is a snowball card. And finally, Ghost. That's a filler card. It will help fill in gaps for your Red Captain buff, but you shouldn't really be dropping Red Captain in the first place. So when you're in Boundless, Ghost is enough to have you at 140% movement speed, which is full Red Captain efficiency, which can make dropping Safety Device sometimes viable. So a note about these buff cards, you do want to hold them if the boss is about to phase, so that you can use it after the entire mech. And not waste up time on it. And a special note for Mayhem, then you can actually stack your attack speed buff slightly ahead of the mech resolving with auto attacks. Okay, moving on to Three-Headed Snake. This card is a pretty okay card. It can help fit an extra red every now and then. I think in general it is better than Balance. But generally, again, you can pretty much use it as soon as you get it. Try to not overlap the buff, but it's not that big of a deal. So the standard usage is weave in 1 auto into a skill into an auto, because this allows you to animation cancel your autos with skills for the fastest stacking possible. This is really good in Addiction. In Boundless, it's not that important. Keep an eye on the buff timer because you really do not want to be sending a 3-stack rain when you thought you had 1 more stack of auto with Three-Headed Snake. One combo to note is Three-Headed Snake plus Balance is an incredibly fast stacking combo, and you can very often easily stack 3 ruins in 1 Cull of Destiny buff. Okay, moving on to Balance. I believe Balance is a pretty shit card in 440. It can help you fit an extra red every now and then. But for the most part, just use it the moment you see it. You do not want it cluttering your head. Alright, for this I have one clip that I had to go record in Trickstream because I do not have a clip of this in real raids because I never do it. I don't really think it's worth it. But in Boundless, you can do this balance cycle, which is pretty optimized and pretty fast. The main takeaway from Balance is that generally you want to pair Edge with Cull of Destiny and keep Scratch Dealer and Flip separate. Alright, moving on to the interesting cards now. Clown. So I'm gonna start with Clown because it's a card that kind of defines a lot of the other cards. You're thinking about Clown a lot. Clown is sometimes a great card, sometimes it's a very terrible card. It will often stay in your hand waiting for a good card, and you really just do not want to be wasting meter because of Clown, okay? So I'm gonna go over a little bit more of this in a second, but just as a list, the cards that are no-brainers that you want to use Clown right after immediately are Cull, Judgement, TF, Wheel, and Royal. You can think about clowning Moon and Corrosion in case the boss is going to a mech phase, and the rest of the cards basically never ever clown them. The one time you can clown a shit card is when Star is your second card and you do not want to bleed meter. Now remember when I said you're thinking about clown the entire time you're using other cards? It's because when you're comboing 2 cards together, you should make sure you use the best one last. And so the order of priority is Judgement is the best, followed by Cull, then Wheel, then Twisted Fate. Remember at the start of the video when I said that you wanted to build muscle memory? This is a habit that you want to take and just be doing automatically. So when you have a good card and you're about to use it and you happen to have Clown as well, just clown it immediately after using the other card. This prevents you from bleeding meter, and it makes sure that you don't accidentally get another card as your latest card used. Alright, and the last concept I want to talk about is simply the Clown Royal combo. This one is another one that you really kind of want to build the muscle memory for, because it's a little tricky to wrap your brain around, but once you have it down, it's pretty natural. It's actually very good because you instantly draw 3 cards, it frees up your hand, and it actually sometimes allows for some insane combos. Alright, now for everybody's favorite card, Star. So obviously never ever ever clown this. Um, and I'm going to go over the situations where you want to use Star. The basic idea being that you never ever want to waste your Boundless, lose it because of Star. Okay, so the very first basic usage is use it when you're at full mana. That way, you're already at full mana, you're not losing anything. Another case where you want to use it is right before using a Judgement, so you can enter Addiction for your burst. The best use for Star is when you're at almost full mana, right after you cast Rain, but before it hits. This gives you Rain Boundless cooldown, but Addiction damage. And note, if you're trying to do this with any other skill than Rain, you have to wait a little bit or you will not be in Addiction. The final use for Star is simply when a mech is happening, or a pattern where the boss can be targeted and you're just having to sit around and do nothing. So just use your Star, get your full mana, and then you can start using mana again. Finally, my last Star tip for you is that if a mech is coming up, you do not need to int your clown on the shit card in order to free your hand, because you can just use the Star instead. Alright, moving on to Cull. So Cull is the second best card in the deck after Judgement, and I don't have specific tips for using Cull. The main thing that you really care about with Cull is that you really want to prioritize Rain and Serendipity, right? One thing to note is that with simply Cull, with no Judgement, Rain is still stronger than Serendipity, right? But you still really want to get Serendipity in it because it is completely worthless outside of having Cull. For some combos, like Cull plus Wheel, you still want to wheel Rain because it is stronger, but you still want to do Rain then Seren into the Cull window because otherwise Seren would be completely useless. Speaking of Wheel, Wheel is a great card. You want to wheel Rain pretty much 99% of the time. The 1% you're gonna wheel Awakening and do a double Awakening combo. But honestly, I never do it. Just wheel Rain. It is so much easier, so much faster. It gets out of your hand, and it just does a buttload of damage. Okay, moving on to Joy. Joy is a decent card. It is most of the time not very useful, but it's actually quite tricky to use correctly, and there are some uses for it, so here we go. The standard use for Joy that I tend to use the most often is simply use it right after Rain, because that's a long cooldown and it's your highest DPS skill. Another great time to use Joy is right after a Judgement, especially when you Judgement in Addiction, because then every red skill is on cooldown and you're getting a lot of value out of it. Another way I like to use it is if I'm sitting on a Clown, then I would rather waste Joy in order to not bleed meter rather than waste Clown. And that same concept kind of applies to any other good card that you might be sitting on for one reason or another. In this case, for example, I'm sitting on Wheel because I'm waiting for Rain. So just use Joy suboptimally so that you're not bleeding meter. Alright, now for the card Judgement. So this is the best card in the game. This is why you play 4/0. It gives you insane burst, it consumes a lot of mana to put you into Boundless, and it generates tons of meter. This basically gives you everything this build wants. It is just the best card in the game. So I'm gonna go through a lot of examples to kind of outline all the cases that you might have to think about, and the best way really you have to play Judgement. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, this is a build for Atropine enjoyers. Atro and Judgments. For the most part, you want to start all Judgment with Scratch Dealer so that you have the synergy, movement speed buff, and attack speed buff to be able to fit more reds for the whole thing. The most important part of Judgment is that you fit Seren and 4 of a kind into the window because these skills benefit the most from being able to be spammed. A very important bit that I haven't touched on that we'll touch on after the card section is adrenaline maintenance. So if you have Cold Judgment and you're ready to send your entire burst window, but you're waiting for the boss to be targetable again, you want to make sure you're upkeeping adrenaline so that you have the full 6 stacks for the entire duration of Judgment. As much as possible, you also want to coordinate with your support to burst on their support buff and also pick up any of the drops they might be leaving on the ground. Alright, remember when I was talking about Clown, how I told you you should use the best card second when you're doing a 2-card combo? So for Judgment, you always want to be using Judgment second so that if you draw a Clown afterwards, you have another Judgment. So for example, here I do it wrong. I use Judgment first and Will second, and wouldn't you know it, I draw a Clown, which gives me another wheel, which, you know, it's not a bad card, but it is no Judgment. Now here's an example of proper ordering, which rewards me with yet another Judgment. Now another key aspect of bursting with Judgment, which you should be familiar with if you play any kind of burst class, is that you only want to burst on patterns where the boss isn't going to go away or enter DR in the middle of the pattern, alright? So right here, for example, I'm waiting to see whether the boss is going to phase into a different phase, because he does that all the time, or if he's going to do a pattern that is going to be long enough for me to do my Judgment burst. So another example in Braille G3 is after the stagger, you have a window, but you do have to be careful about the yellow lines, which will interrupt your Judgment call, so you have to wait until after the yellow lines to be able to burst. Here I could have gone a little earlier though. Sometimes you'll also get a good card in the middle of Judgment, and you'll be really tempted to use it, but you've already sent most of your good skills, so you have to sit on it. However, you also draw a ton of cards during Judgment, like I mentioned earlier, so you also want to be able to recognize cards fast and use them fast if they're bad cards so that you don't bleed meter. And in the same idea of not bleeding meter, you also want to be able to react really fast to drawing Judgment and be able to send your full burst, if it's available, at a moment's notice. And again, because I don't want to be bleeding meter, sometimes even though Seren is not up, I'm still going to send my whole burst with Judgment because I would be bleeding so much meter if I didn't send it. Alright, so to conclude, here's an example of properly executing it, stacking Adrenaline first, with support buff, scratching first, using Atro, combining with the Awakening for Cull on Deathbound, using Judgment second, and not panicking and using Wheel. And finally, Twisted Fate. It's a pretty good card, it's a decent clown target because you can use it fast. In general, it doesn't have that much value. Generally, you should just be happy buffing Raid and Garden and getting rid of it quickly so that you don't bleed meter. One thing to note for Twisted Fate is that the color of the text indicates how good the buff is. So if the text is gold, that is a 40% damage buff. If the text is white, that is 10 to 20% damage buff. And if there is no text, then there is no buff and you'll actually get a debuff instead. Alright, so that's it for the cards. You'll notice I didn't really talk about Royal by itself. Because in general, just try to use it with 2 open slots. It's fine to use on 1 slot if you have another good card already. But for the most part, there's not much to talk about. Alright, for this last part of the guide, I want to talk about a couple of tips that don't really apply to a specific skill or a specific card, and they're more general tips that will help get you into the proper state. So generally, they're outside of the core gameplay when you haven't even started the fight yet, or if you're waiting during a mechanic. Alright, so the first tip is adrenaline upkeep. So upkeeping adrenaline to 6 stacks is super easy and brain dead when you're actually playing the fight because you don't have to think about it at all. But when you're waiting, say because the boss is invulnerable during a mech or doing a pattern where you can't hit him, you might have to actually think about upkeeping adrenaline. And so for me, the priority is on Seren, unless you're preparing for a Cull, because Seren is completely useless outside of Cull and Judgment. Garden is a great one as well because it has such a short cooldown. and then 4 of a kind is also a pretty good one, as well as spiral edge. A super interesting technique that I don't even do enough myself. People like to call it shadowboxing, which is essentially while you have extended periods of time where you're waiting for the boss to come back and be hittable, you're just fighting in the air, throwing your skills out in order to consume mana and keep your mana bar to a point where you can essentially enter boundless again the moment the boss is fightable again. So this next tip kind of combines both Adrent upkeep and shadowboxing, which is essentially your shadowboxing, you're using your skills while in the workshop or while in the box entering a fight, getting your adrenaline stacks up before the fight actually begins. And you can apply a very similar technique on the run up toward Red Guardians, like Sonovel and Gargadeth, so that you enter the fight with 6 adrenaline stacks so that your awakening combo gets the full adrenaline value. Alright, this tip, you should also be extremely familiar with it if you play any kind of class that has meter. But basically, you can farm meter on bosses that are simply DR'd, right? You can also farm meter on trash mobs before a fight begins. And so realistically, you really want to be farming for good cards whenever you get the chance. So the priority for cards is similar to the priority I said earlier, right? Judgement, Cull, Wheel, TF are your 4 best cards that you really want to be looking for. Most of the time, I will keep TF unless I have enough time to farm a better card before the fight starts. One more thing I want to mention about this specific topic is that if you care about that, on the MVP screen, your damage towards non-boss monsters is not counted. So for example, in Braille G1, you can absolutely farm meter on the dogs, on the statues, and then even on the split part of the fight. That way you can keep all your good cards for when the actual fight begins, because that damage will be counted towards MVP. And final tiny tip, on Braille, G0, Awakening so that you proc Nightmare early, so you don't have to waste Awakening later for Nightmare. And that's the end of the guide. Hopefully all this information was helpful. The goal of all these tips and examples I provided is to help you make the correct decision faster, so that eventually all these things become instinctive and muscle memory. You're going to run into some scenarios that I didn't cover, and as long as you keep the priorities I mentioned in mind, you'll know what to do. If there's one thing you take away from this video, it is play fast. Alright, thanks a lot for watching. Please let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this guide and if it was helpful, and if there's any other raids of videos you'd like me to upload for Empress Arcana. Peace.